Good morning, Propenomix people, and welcome to another Sunday supplement. This week's was called, I'll try not to sing it, Oh, We're Halfway There, of course, from Bon Jovi's Living on a Prayer, and it's to signify the end of the first half of the year. So for those who've listened before, you'll know that I like to start with a quote, and that quote is, annual income £20, annual expenditure £19.19 shillings and sixpence, result happiness. Annual income £20, annual expenditure £20, ought and six, result misery. And that's a famous quote from Mr. Micawber from Charles Dickens' David Copperfield about spending more than you've got or not. So the quote's about affordability, and you'll see why when we get into the deep dive. But before I go in full throttle, Rod and I are running one more workshop on Thursday the 3rd this week, 3rd of July. Joint ventures, mergers and acquisitions this time around. It's always a popular one. Quick whistle stop of the agenda. Market dynamics, JV opportunities, optimal legal structuring for property businesses, pros and cons of limited companies, share classes, shareholder agreements, and sustainable JV models. Capital structuring, comparing debt to equity, managing risk and understanding personal guarantees properly, gaining insight into property M&A from due diligence to asset versus share purchases. Applying concepts through 2 in-depth case studies, acquiring an asset-backed property company, and navigating a distressed business sale. Understanding strategic disposals, company wind-ups, and how to negotiate under pressure whilst maximising value. There's only a couple of tickets left, so book now or forever regret your errors. Book at bit.ly/PBW7. There is a link in the show notes as well. So I'll crack on with Trump Watch. I wrote last week that soon enough a bluff would have to have been called, and sure enough, as I slept after finishing last week's output, it was airstrikes on Iran, the biggest foreign policy gamble of his presidency, it was described as. Regime change was floated as well. Not ideal, perhaps, given the West's track record of regime change in the Middle East, or in fact anywhere in the world over the past 30 years. I'm sure you would agree. Hard to split the politics from the facts, but the leaked internal report claiming that things have only been set back about 3 months is not ideal. I guess you can't bomb knowledge, although the job adverts for covert nuclear scientists required for anonymous country, warm weather, only those with 10 plus years experience need apply, probably aren't getting inundated with applications either after the weekend. But Congress wasn't happy about not being consulted, of course, and the breaking of international law was mentioned, without anyone really being able to do anything about it anyway. Wash up, make friends, allow some retaliatory bombing, and everyone's friends again? Well, not again, just friends, maybe. Seems unlikely, doesn't it? Not the final chapter here, I think we would all have to agree. Gun deregulation by executive order. Yep, God bless America. Throw in the reaffirmed travel ban, but efficient treatment for 1,000 Afrikaner farmers from South Africa. The Supreme Court, here's one I prepared earlier, overruled lower courts who were imposing injunctions on executive orders, voted 6-3. How strange when 6 are considered conservative and 3 considered liberal. Who'd have bet on that? Long-term economic consequences of Big Beautiful Bill, not talking about Clinton, came up this week, suggesting trillions more debt would be piled onto younger generations. Yep, that's accurate. Economically, inflation was a little hotter than expected in the US. That's the core month on month. And personal income unexpectedly fell. Not ideal. And the R word is being mentioned more and more by the commentators. The same people who usually predict 9 of the next 2 recessions. So let's not get overexcited yet, though. Anyway, on to the UK and the real-time property market, intrepid ones. Chris Watkin is the Luke Littler of estate and lettings facts. Week 24 is this week's 180. Listings printed 37.7 thousand. No material change on last week's 37.6k, but still 5% higher than 2024 year to date and 7.7% higher than the pre-pandemic market. My 10% more stock than a normal market ready reckoner is still just about close enough. We're hanging on to that one really, closer to 7.5 at the moment, obviously. But we're 15.9% ahead of the 9-year average on listings, although that would be a more meaningful figure if we withdrew 2020, of course, which does pollute the figures somewhat because the listings were so low, thanks to COVID, of course. 26,800 price reductions, 14% of stock reduced in May compared to last year's 12.1. April's 13.4, and the 5-year average of 10.6. So reduction percentages gaining pace as more and more stock also hits the market, which means more and more absolute reductions, of course. If you look at the difference between 14% and 10.6, the average, that's 32% more reductions than the 5-year average. So my ready reckoner here is about 25% more reduced stock than a normal market, right? At least, realistically. 1 in 7 properties are being reduced each month. So we're currently running at a little over 100,000 price reductions per month, to be clear. Say you can't find a deal, have a word. 28,300 homes sold subject to contract. Healthy is still the watchword. Sold subject to contracts are up 8.2% year on year and 16% up on 2017 to 19, and still nearly keeping pace with 2022, which to this point was a very hot market indeed. We went into June with 756,675 homes on the market. As the market got stickier before the pandemic, that number was about 660,000. A seller's market is much more likely to be under 600,000 pieces of stock. At the end of May 24, 694,000 were on the market. It's a lumpy trend upwards in just May. And with this amount of stock on the market, it will be continually hard for prices to surge forward in the coming months. The flat feeling will likely manifest in a steady market without much excitement as we get really stuck into the summer proper. The first month which sees fewer on the market that isn't November or December would be a tell that the glut of stock, provided at least in part by exiting landlords, the never spoken about truth of this current market, has reached its peak. But there's no guarantee that we are there yet. Chris also looked at the success percentage this week, and this stat will surprise you, no doubt, which is why I'm sharing it. The astute will notice I often talk of the 1 to 1.2 million homes that transact every year. Those are the ones we're most interested in, of course. However, how much is listed is also of interest, of course, especially when it tells a story. Where has all this stock come from, for example? From landlords exiting is my main theory, which has some support from reporting from the portals over the past 12 months. Circa 20% of what's being listed at some points were ex-rentals, so gauge the stock that had been on those same portals for rent within the past 4 years, versus 7 to 9% of all finance that is being advanced for buy-to-let properties. I'd describe that as compelling circumstantial evidence at best, at the very least. However, I make very little of the fact that over 1.6 million homes are listed each year in a typical year, and therefore there must be hundreds of thousands of homes being listed that do not transact. What happens to those? Well, in the main, they're just withdrawn from the market, and those potential vendors do not move. If I tried to encapsulate what I believe is the major factor driving that, I'd blame overvaluation, which is the cancer on the industry imposed by the corporates. Tell the vendor it's worth more than it is in order to get the instruction, then once in a lockout contract, work the vendor down mercilessly on price as the market gives them the reality of the situation. Now, that won't work on everyone, of course. Some will feel a deep feeling of unfairness. Some will have made plans solely based on what they were told on day one that they could get for their house, right? And they might be unwilling or therefore unable to drop the price. Now, if no one ever reduced, and we can tell that they do, of course, over 100,000 a month at the moment, as already said, then the practice would no doubt have to stop, as corporates would sell such a low percentage of homes. There will be other reasons, of course. People just change their mind. We had it happen on a property we had on the market last week, completely unreasonably, to be honest, but there you go. That flaky English-Welsh system doesn't work fantastically for many of us who are invested in it. But as I say, the stat might truly stop you in your tracks, right? In May 2025, 51.7% of all properties that left estate agency books were actually transacted on. The other 48.3 were removed unsold. Seriously, it's nearly a coin flip. I like that stat so much, I used it as this week's image. So credit to Chris and thanks to him for providing that. In March, that number took a rare foray above 60%, but of course that was mostly because of the large spike in transactions to 150,000 plus on the month, thanks to the stamp duty changes. This stat actually spends its time in the low to mid 50s in a normal looking market. What a dysfunctional system we operate within. There was a net increase of stock of over 40,000 homes on the market in May this year. May 2018 was similar, but a more normal or typical May looks more like sort of 10 or 15,000 being added on. So still piling stock onto the fire here. Maybe not reading too much into that just yet, but how much stock can this market cope with before it goes officially buyer's market? The 756,000 number is the highest for many years. And when buyers don't match sellers, you know what has to give, and that's price. So am I calling a drop in pricing here? No, but I'm calling not much of an increase in the immediate future while this stock level stays the same. Not really even keeping up with wage rises and inflation. So I'd expect flat output from the Halifax and the nationwide over the coming months, for example, in their house price indices. And this is supported this week by Chris sharing the pounds per square foot pricing data for May 25 as well. So £346.25 a foot was the number, which hasn't moved much since November 2024. There's noise up and down, but £342 was the number in November 24. So that's 1.25% over 6 months, with, to my logic, 3 more flat months coming. Predictions this year of 3 to 4% rises. The market consensus and my own number was 3.75%. Look to be dashed somewhat unless there's a late flurry in Q4. December's number in 2025 was was £339 per foot. So we're 2.1% up on that, but the pounds per square foot metric tends to drop back each December. So when you measure December to December, which is important, of course, you've got to compare apples with apples. That will drop back a bit, which is why I talked about November's number and the fact we're 1.25% ahead of that at the moment. So close, but a miss to the downside looks most likely for my annual prediction for pricing at this point. Chris loves to share his graph of significant correlation between the sole subject to contract price per foot and the land reg prices 5 months down the line. And that's just because sole subject to contract is taking about 5 months to get over the line on average, which is why he picks that particular number. Incredibly strong correlation, well into the 90s on the correlation coefficient. It's about as good as it gets, really. So May's number drops in October, if you like. So we've already probably had something close to October's land registry number. So that, with that logic in mind, once we have July's numbers, that should provide us with December's completions loosely, although we do have to remember December behaves a little bit differently. So let's just be cautious there. Fall throughs are staying below the 7-year average, 23.2%. The week before they were 22.8. Normal noise. Net sales still playing ball, 6% up on last year, 11.2% higher than 17 to 19. Not quite 22 levels, but the stamp cliff will have forced a few more transactions out of bed, of course. And as the year progresses, then in the absence of any more shocks, things will likely catch up because transactions got significantly disturbed by the 2022 budget and the bond markets, of course, in comparison to what hopefully and should happen in 2025. I always give Chris a weekly shout out here because he's more prolific than just this epic tome he releases weekly on the UK property market and all the rest of it, and some kind words for his content creation. Make sure you drop him a like, give him a subscribe, and if you're in the industry and want support with growing your business or to be a more effective communicator, be more in touch with your local market, give him a shout. The article gets published weekly on the Property Industry Eye website, and the video goes on his YouTube channel at Christopher Watkin. Okay, let's get lost in the macroverse together. In many ways, my favourite week of the month, mostly because we get the flash PMIs. They must be up first for analysis. There's nothing else the markets consider particularly important, which is a rare week, mostly just because the month ended on a Monday. So we'll just do the PMIs and the gilts this week then. Only kidding. That would never happen. This is a chance to fill a couple of the other slots with data points we don't look at particularly often. I'm going to talk about public opinions and social trends. There's a little bit of risk of me going slightly off-piste here, but in case readers and listeners aren't aware of this monthly publication by the ONS, if you feel the Overton window, what's currently capturing political discourse, is shifting or has shifted, this is an evidence-based way to look at it. It might give insight into future voting trends, and beyond that, how the entire system might shift as time goes on. There's also the Homes England house building stats for the 2024-25 fiscal year, which were released this week and give insight into housing programmes delivered by Homes England and just how different they were to the year before. Okay, without further ado, the flash PMIs. The strapline, just absolutely magnificent compared to the last 9 months or so. Output growth picks up in June. Prices charged inflation eases to its lowest for nearly 4.5 years. Honestly, if you were on the Monetary Policy Committee that sets the base rate of interest, that headline alone if you were so predisposed, which you wouldn't be, otherwise you wouldn't be on the MPC, would be enough to make you vote to cut rates next time out, I think. It's not how central bankers work, but let's see just how good the actual figures are in the report. The composite index up from 50.3 to 50.7. I'm not going to lie, after that headline, I was expecting more. Services 51.3 to 50.9, which basically explains all of the move in the composite. Manufacturing 47.7, still anemic, but up from 46.4, so half decent progress. But the talk was very positive overall. Let's dig in a little further, and I might reach for the cold water tap, I'm afraid. Why would prices charged inflation be the lowest since January 2021? It is great news all round. Well, not so much for business, but is it because the options for profit-led inflation are lower than they have been over all of that time? It isn't like costs have abated much. Firms must still be reeling from awful April. Down in the detail, the report does admit the upturn is marginal. Overseas demand is still suffering from tariff uncertainty, and as discussed, that 90-day deadline is nearly upon us, right? They still report private sector employment down for the 9th consecutive month, faster than in May, and hiring freezes and redundancies are up. The chief business economist prefers to characterise the UK economy as sluggish as we end Q2, or H1 if you prefer, and he throws a dart at the economy growing at 0.1% in the second quarter. I still think this is best case scenario, and let's not forget minus 0.3 for April is already on the books. It doesn't seem like the chief business economist wrote the headline. Indeed, business confidence lost ground in June, although he points to geopolitics for that. He finishes, as he often does, using his little corner of influence to tell the Bank of England what to do, and points out that near stalled growth, falling employment and lower inflation opens the door to the Bank of England to cut rates. I'd have to agree with his assessment on the face of it, as long as we all ignore that core inflation is well over 3%, CPI is well over 3% and will be for the rest of the year, and the likes. I'm not sure when those are penciled in to fall below 3% at the moment, let alone 2%, but why let that put you off? Or, being less flippant, the counter-argument is saying, act now, because it takes months and even years for the rate cuts to take effect, which is true, and the economy is more important than inflation right now. It's true, but it's not the Bank of England's precise brief, you will note. And, above 3 is still not safe territory necessarily. 3 is probably okay, 3.5. Starts to get a bit sweaty. 4, suboptimal, and you can lose control on the upside very quickly. So the OIS curves, the overnight index swaps, indicate what the market thinks of base rate in 1 year's time, indicated 3.43 at the end of last week, the current market view, or that would mean 3 more cuts, because we're at 4.25 today, in the next 12 months or 8 meetings. That's definitely trended downwards quite helpfully for the past few months. Remember, though, all of this is already priced into the gilts and the swaps, in theory, anyway. Public opinions and social trends, then. A monthly report, unlike many others released by the ONS, very much up to date. This data was collected between the 7th of May and the 1st of June. One question asked in the report is, what are the most important issues facing the UK today? Now, people are allowed to answer more than one thing to this question. 86% said the cost of living, 85% said the NHS, and 70% said the economy. 62% of adults reported an increase in the cost of living in the past month. That probably would have been the ones who pay the council tax bills, I would have thought. But then it was 72% in the report before. That was April, when obviously those rises sort of bit. But 92% said the cost of their food shop went up. And probably means 8% weren't really paying attention, which pertains to that fairly dramatic jump to food inflation back over 4%, as I reported on last week. 48% of adults said they would be able to save in the coming 12 months. Under 50s were ahead of over 50s on this stat, though, interestingly enough. 53% reported climate change as an important issue, which has trended downwards as a whole since July 2023, when that number was 69%. Now, I find that interesting, and the realist in me says people think that it is important until they need to pay for it. And then when there are climate levies right, left and centre on top of inflation, the importance starts to fade away somewhat. That 53% out of interest breaks back as 57% of female respondents and 50% of male respondents. What else is important below the headlines, though? 62% said crime, 59% said immigration, and 56% said housing were the important issues facing us at the moment. 42% said employment, 48% said international conflict, 46% said education, and 13% said industrial action, which has trended down from being in the 40s during the COVID strike period, as it will be known when it's consigned to history, I'm sure. Alongside the 92% reporting food prices going upwards, 21% reported rent or mortgage costs going up, 69% said utility bills, and 37% said fuel. On savings, the older you get, the less you think you can save, maybe to a large extent. I'm not sure people are actually reporting on their ability to save here. I think they more report on how likely they are to actually save. But that's just my opinion, of course. I think it might make sense. The average 16 to 29-year-old might still be living at home, supported more by family, or just being in a multi-generational household without dependents. At 50 to 69, the household income bracket might start to trend downwards. It definitely does at some point during that age bracket, usually around 55 from the long-term stats that I've seen. And so there's less ability to save, even if dependents are largely grown by then. The report also calls across to another report, which I'll sneak in here, around hybrid working. 28% of working adults worked hybrid between January and March 2025. A few sub-headlines from that summary out of interest. Workers with a degree or equivalent qualification were 10 times more likely to work hybrid than those with no qualifications. The higher the income band, the more likely the hybrid work. Hybrid work is more common in less deprived areas, which kind of follows on, of course. Full-time hybrid work is much more likely than part-time hybrid work. It's also more common among employees than the self-employed. The age band most likely to do hybrid work are those between 30 and 49. Of course, annoyingly, this data series only starts in May 2020, because it then became obvious it would be key to collect this data. At that point, 30% were travelling to work, around 35% worked from home, and about 10% were working hybrid. And no, I'm not really sure what the other 25% were doing, although we do cover that later on. There was also a change in the wording of the survey in March 2022, so that makes apples and apples not perfectly possible. But from that point on, hybrid's been volatile, but trending upwards, and its current 28% is pretty much near the top for the data series. Working from home, in spite of what the media has fed us, actually trended down until March 2022, and then has largely moved sideways, sitting at about 15% at the moment. That's full working from home, no office, right? The movement since March 2022 is just very flat with a bit of noise, realistically. So ignore the headlines largely on that front. And so travelling to work has only trended down by roughly the same amount that hybrid has trended up. So presumably the other 25% don't fit into one of the three boxes. As I've said, it's not I only hybrid work, or I only do this, or I only do that. The fourth choice in the survey, apparently according to the ONS, is employed but didn't work. Now, bearing in mind the data period here, it seems a strangely high amount. Now that adds up to 90% rather than 75%, but it's too long a period to just have been on holiday. So these people employed but sick, I don't know. Couldn't say. But we're roughly at 45% travelling to work only today, 28% hybrid only, and 15% or so working from home only. So it's about 88% and 12% employed but didn't work. You'll have to use your imagination for that one, folks, I'm afraid. Okay, what about the Homes England housing stats that were published this week? Well, the tail of the tape, key results: 38,308 starts, 36,872 completions in England, 30,087 affordable starts on site, so about 79% of all of their starts, and a massive 0.6% year-on-year increase. Not really what Labour Party were looking for. Now, having been deep into social and affordable or unaffordable over the past weeks here in the supplement, I thought a breakdown of these tenures would be interesting. So of these 30,087 starts, 18,942 have a tenure yet to be confirmed, which kind of drives a bit of a truck through the point of it to an extent. But this is important, apparently, as flexibility for strategic partnerships. Now, it would be very easy to be very cynical here. However, 5,680 were for social rent, which has to be seen as a victory. 43% up, right? But in reality, not even 6,000 homes being started for social rent in England. Angela Rayner's got a long way to go. 2,800 were for shared ownership and rent to buy. That's down 27%, presumably because more of those have turned social. 2,665 were for affordable rent, down 18%. Again, presumably because they've gone social. A positive move, realistically, if you look at the fact that we've got more homes being started than we had completions and more social rent, that would have to be pretty good as a product mix goes. Now, the problem is when you look at the real numbers, you know, it's a tiny pebble in a pond, ultimately, of 30 million households. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. But it's probably the first bit of real evidence I could point to that Labour have made some right moves in the right direction and had some impact, which should be positive for society at all level, because social housing really is a critical part of infrastructure, even though it is not currently economically recognised as such. How about completions? Well, nothing to do with Labour here, really, you'd think, although they could have had considerable influence over those 10 years to be confirmed, you'd imagine, at the time they actually started. 28,370 affordable completions was up 15% on the previous year, broken down into 11,883 for shared ownership or rent to buy, the biggest slice, up 13%. 10,755 for affordable rent, up 15%, and 5,732 completions for social rent, also up 33%. So all good news, but on the back of a very weak building year in 23-24, which of course is what we're comparing to here, where construction inflation, aside from anything else, aside from the moves in the market in terms of pricing, the uncertainty of the limp market, but I don't want to pour too much cold water on that. It is the right direction. 1.5 million homes still remains an utter embarrassing egg-on-face pipe dream, but there we go. As a side note, London isn't included here since that's down to the mayor, has been devolved to the mayor for some years now, apart from where Homes England have administered a programme on behalf of the Greater London Authority. But, you know, make no mistake, that social rent housing starts at 5680 is a really dramatic increase. If I give you in reverse order, so starting with 23-24, the social rent starts back to 2017-18. You had 3961, 2226, 1853, 2472, 2770, 1332, and 1693. So you can see the quantum of the challenge that the government are trying to work with, but also they light their own funeral pyre when they make these ridiculous claims about 1.5 million homes. It looks like they are making a bit of difference in this space, and they've certainly rocketed the trend forward so far. So credit where it's due. They don't get a lot, and they certainly don't get a lot from me. But, you know, social rents, it's a key part of the system. We need a better system for rent anyway. Granger talk about flex rents as a way around it, or the community rent model, which is Darren Rodwell's baby. These things are drastically needed rather than giving people lifetime tenancies in social housing to give them surety. You shouldn't have people who are earning 100k plus in social housing, but that's exactly what the lifetime tenancy does. Ridiculous, quite frankly. It doesn't help generations going forward. You can have stability and transition periods of moving of 12-month notice, for example, which is very easy to comprehend and plenty of time to do something about, rather than giving people lifetime tenancies. But anyway, soapbox over very briefly, of course. Wind up on the macro. What about the gilts and swaps? I mentioned the 1-year forward curve, the base rate prediction at 3.43. I didn't tell you that was down from 3.54 the week before, so it's down about 11 bips on the week. And that would normally be indicative of a down week on the gilts, and that's exactly what we had. We closed at 3.972 yield on the 5-year after we opened at 4.067. Very little dissent in the market. A calm trend downwards in the first half of the week, and then mostly sideways in the second half of the week. Below the magic 4% as the hot weather gets to everyone. I'm going to start talking about the 30-year curve weekly as well. Now, this could be a very long project, but the steepness of the yield curve looks even sharper than last week after my epic tome on what the yield curve is telling us. And what it's telling us is the system has now baked in a lot of inflation, which means much higher rates in the future, which will affect us in terms of mortgages and things like that. But of course, if that inflation doesn't manifest, those will come down, rates will come down. It's also to do with the fact we're just overspending, frankly, on government, not collecting enough tax, or spending too much, or not growing fast enough, which is the basic three that Ray Dalio enshrines in some of his latest works. Very well worth checking out. So the 30-year moved on the week from 5.295 to 5.275% yield. So hardly a move of the needle based on the change in 1-year expectations. Of course, 1-year expectations make a much bigger difference to the 5-year than they do to the 30-year. It's self-evident that that's the case, I hope. But the yield curve tells an interesting story this week because the 3-year gilt closed at 3.661, and then it climbs fairly steeply towards the 5-year and beyond. If it continues, a strategy I've advised against, for many years, might be worth a punt if you believe inflation will be back under control within 3 years' time, or if you believe a recession is inevitable under this government. One swallow does not a summer make, so let's not draw that conclusion yet. But with a 30+ basis point difference between the 3-year and the 5-year, a 3-year mortgage might be an interesting solution. And there are not that many products, and there is a bit of an issue with that. That's just the gilt yield curve, right? We're better off, as you'll know if you're a regular listener, to look at the swap rates to make such a conclusion, or even just to posit such a hypothesis. And the reality is the 3-year swap traded at 3.555 Thursday's close, and that compared to 3.615 on the 5-year. So there's very little in it on the swaps, but I'll certainly be keeping an eye on it. The 3.615 is great news and sees 5.6 as this week's best guess of the cost of debt. There is lower available, 5-year limited company. I've seen 5.45 around, so working to lower margins there. But the cautious one within me still says 6% cost of debt for stacking deals. But very soon, if we carry on this for a few more weeks, I will be able to move that down to 5.75 as my 6 months' time best guess for cost of a 5-year 75% interest-only mortgage, which will open up some more avenues for me on the purchasing side of things. What will I be looking out for? Stability on the forward curves, and the market to get the cut it is now very much expecting in August. This week has very much played out to make that look even more likely, though. 3.951 was the market close on the 5-year gilt on Thursday. So that was still a 33 basis point discount between the gilts and the swaps. So all in all, good week for the gilts. But the sad reality is that a flat economy and unemployment going the wrong way is all that's needed to help calm inflation down. Give people less money and they can't spend it, basically. The others also continue to be worried and choose to save rather than spend, right? Not ideal, but for interest rate cooling, it's perhaps necessary and it's better than a recession. I wouldn't change anything in the overall reporting of the path of the interest rates, though. 3 cuts now the expectation in 12 months is still in line with slow and steady, which has been the Bank of England line since the start of this cutting cycle. Is it 1 this year and then 2 early next year? So August is looking ever so likely, as I've said, even more likely. Or is it 2 this year and 1 in next calendar year? My gut says don't jump ship yet and stick with 1 this year, which was my adjusted prediction. I thought there'd only be 2 cuts this year, but it's fairly obvious it's going to be 3 now, at least. So, but inflation is still struggling to get under 3.5%. But there's a fair bit of freedom down to 3.5% in market terms, in terms of the actual base rate, right? Because the market believes that's the natural rate or thereabouts. Cutting below 3.5 as of today would be relatively difficult to justify. Although if you really feel the economy needs some stimulus, I think you'd need inflation to be down below sort of 2.5 to get there. Although it's not necessarily real-time inflation. They do look at inflation over the forecast period, which is 3 years. So the 3-year forecast would need to see inflation at probably 1.6 or below for us to go below that 3.5% base rate, if indeed we're going to get there next year, which is the current thought. And this is what the market is saying, of course. Remember, this is what all the bond markets stitch together. This is the story that they tell. I think there are further inflation-related struggles yet to come, personally, whether they come from the Middle East or from elsewhere. And the genie is not yet back in the bottle. And too much of the COVID-inspired inflation has embedded itself within the system. In many ways, we can't clear that out without a recession. But slow, sluggish, treacle-like economy, as I've referred to for the last 2.5 years now, is much more likely than a recession, unless there is a trigger event. Okay, enough for the macro this week. Time to the deep dive. I've wanted for some weeks to look at the changes in mortgage lending that have been referred to a number of times in various places since earlier this year. And this is the week I'm going to do that. Why is this important? Well, because with looser lending conditions, house prices will rise more than they otherwise would have done. The availability of credit, which also has to include a notion of the price or affordability of it, is the #1 driver of UK house prices, not the economy, not employment, not anything else, right? This does make a lot of sense if you consider that most house purchases are funded by more than 50% of borrowed money. So therefore, that money will dictate more than 50% of the direction of travel of house prices. It doesn't get lent without jobs, of course, so it isn't the only driver, but it is the chief one. So back to the context here. You might remember, although there's so many times it's happened, you might well not. Starmer was derided and jeered at in the press for asking for help from regulators as to what the regulators themselves would change in order to find some growth. There's probably two broad positions to take on that here. The Thomas Sowell, look him up if you don't know who he is. He's an incredible thinker, philosopher and author, but he's too conservative for many. You would summarise that as the regulator looks after the regulator. Don't ask them to cut their powers or their budgets or they'll be out of a job. They won't do that. And then opposing the Sowell position might be the inherent optimist. Sure, the regulators can see what goes wrong and what might be needed to cut out some of that waste. It'd be lovely to think that would be the case as well. But as usual, as often, I sit somewhere between the two poles, although I likely sit a little bit closer to the Sowell position, or Sowell position. However, my take would more be, well, it depends on how you position the problem. So let me elaborate. If you go to the regulators talking fairly tough, as in, you need to come up with some meaningful loosening of the belt here, otherwise I'm going to send in some tough operators to do it for you, well, that could work as a one-off arrangement. Labour would be buoyed by the fact that their changes to the National Planning Policy Framework were deemed by the OBR, who are the markers of the homework, of course, to add 0.2% to GDP by 2030. Any sensible leader at that point would have said, we need more of the same, please. So this does actually make sense. There's a more obvious political gain here as well, potentially, right? Labour aren't doing well in the polls, which is not atypical for an incumbent. And the hard stuff is largely done, I'd expect, although indeed it's mostly been chickened out of with U-turns, as you might know, but there we go. This is all notwithstanding a black swan or a crisis, of course, but they've inherited a party. They've inherited a pretty bad situation. I'm not talking about the 22 billion black holes. I'm talking about demographics and the NHS. The population problem, many more getting older than coming into the workforce, leaves an impossible solution of even more migration, which would be a guaranteed loss at the next election, you'd think, given where people put migration in their list of priorities at the moment, or spending cuts or outsized growth, right? The first two aren't going to wash by the looks of it or be enacted, so that only leaves you with number 3, which makes you understand why Rachel Reeves going around saying growth, growth, growth. But of course, she needs to actually do things that make that happen rather than saying it and then doing things that are anti-growth, which has been one of the chief problems of this government so far. So cutting the regulations is one of the factors that could boost that growth. The ramping up of costs for business or the introduction of more regulations, both of which have been done and are being done, are not conducive to this, as I said. But back to the obvious political gain. There's a great correlation between the property market and the success of an incumbent government at the next election. Still, as at today, many traditional right-leaning news outlets and individual figures are questioning the true capability and likelihood, and frankly, the appetite of Nigel Farage to actually be the next Prime Minister and Richard Tice to be the Chancellor. Westminster is still not taking it very seriously at all, but outside of that bubble, the people are. And I expect many readers and listeners are feeling relatively politically homeless at this point and would at least have some sensible questions about what a reform government would really mean. Aside from selectively borrowing from reform policy, which has already been going on, another clever way of outflanking them and making the most of the incumbent's advantage, which is fairly legendary in politics, is to make sure the housing market is doing well. A subtle shot in the arm would help, and indeed a Labour insider has confirmed as much to me. This is definitely policy, but policy that would never be spoken of, because inflating house prices doesn't help the core Labour membership base, who are more likely to rent than own, of course. However, 2/3 of the country is owned households, whether it's mortgaged or not, and the older you are, the more likely you are both to vote and to own a home. So this all makes sense, and also not speaking of it makes sense, because your core base would be very upset with you for even thinking it out loud, I'm sure. So, on to what's actually happened since this ask of the regulators to find a way. And remember, this ask was across the board, but I'm going to focus on mortgage regulations and guidance here, as they are the ones that will have an impact on house prices. Back in November 2024, the Bank of England Financial Policy Committee, not the one that I focus on, that's the Monetary Policy Committee, recommend raising the volume threshold at which the 4.5 times income cap applies from 100 million to 150 million of annual new mortgage lending. That's a decent 50% increase, of course, and this was in a consultation paper issued in April. Consultation closed in May, and final rules should take effect in the second half of 2025. What does it mean? It means more people can borrow at above 4.5 times joint income. I've alluded to Nationwide 6 times income product. You can see where this is limited, but also that Nationwide can issue an extra 50 million of these without being subject to what we might colloquially call the 15% rule. That is that no more than 15% of new loans can exceed 4.5 times income, technically called the flow limit threshold, if you were interested. The 15% could be changed, of course. You could change it to 20%. That would have a more dramatic impact. But the more conservative nature of the regulator has not allowed that change to creep into the Overton window just yet. My view would be more, why not change it steadily, move it to 16% to start with, creep it upwards, so if it gets too high, you can trim it back down again. But that's my view as someone who hates arbitrary limits that just happen to be to the nearest 5% rather than scientifically derived or data-driven solutions. What's also on the table at the moment? Simplifying mortgage rules with a consultation paper published in May 2025 by the FCA. So this would include loosening the requirement for advice, which is gauged as perhaps a little heavy-handed in vanilla cases, allowing some lenders to operate as execution only without providing full advice. There would still be safeguards and there would still be a duty to those consumers, of course, under the FCA's catch-all consumer duty rules. But advice would remain mandatory for debt consolidation, equity release and things like that, which sounds very sensible. Now, the next bit will delight many. Ability to reduce the mortgage term or remortgage to a new lender without a full affordability retest, assuming the change doesn't increase monthly payments. Lenders could use this optionally depending on their risk appetite. The point is a lighter touch and a faster and cheaper process, therefore, increasing competition on remortgages. This consultation closed in early June. There will be a policy statement by the end of Q3. Nothing concrete yet, but the right language in terms of deregulating rather than regulating further. There is no need, according to the FCA, for a long implementation period, so these changes could be in place by the end of the year, but they are, of course, not guaranteed. There's also a discussion paper on a pertinent subject which is close to my heart at this time, the future mortgage market. Particularly, much more demand for later life lending, more self-employment, and they mention specifically rebalancing the collective risk appetite in mortgage lending. Positive sounding chat, but of course, at this point in time. Said discussion is open until 19th of September, after which rule changes will be considered. I personally believe equity release is a fantastic part of any estate planning and is certainly a part of my later life plan without a doubt. I'm getting stuck into it as soon as I'm old enough. But again, the chat is positive in terms of oil for the wheels, in terms of the system and some sensible deregulation. So now to the other side, talk of stronger protections for borrowers in financial difficulty. Changes already took place in November 24 to provide more proactive and enhanced support to customers in difficulty already or at risk. More options, more broadly looking at other debts of the customer, only repossessing as a last resort. There's already embedded release from 2023 in terms of people being able to request 6 months interest only or a term extension without an affordability assessment. Sensible, but already in place. Okay, that's the regulatory landscape summary. What have the lenders done in response? Generally, they've been welcomed, as you would imagine. All of this should cut costs and improve the customer experience or journey. March 25 saw a reminder published by the FCA about the existing flexibility in the interest rate stress test rules because they knew the borrowers were being stress tested at rates that are frankly unrealistic. To simplify, if you imagine the stress test was prescribed, this is from 2014 to 2022, at 5.5% or 5.25%, as it dropped to in 2021, lenders may have interpreted that as 2% above borrowing rate, or at some points, 4% above borrowing rate. Generally interpreted it as 1% above the SVR sort of thing, although those numbers were actually prescribed by the FCA because they felt they needed to be able to say, and the BRA, they felt they needed to be able to say, look, remember interest rates will go up at some point. And indeed, when they did go back up, it was these stress tests that saved a big problem in the UK housing market. So credit to the regulator for bringing that one in. But adding sort of 2% on or to the pay rate or 1% onto the SVR or whatever, when rates have already normalised, especially when you look at sensible historical context, because rates a couple of years ago had moved back to normal, but in reality, they were on quite a high side, as I commented at the time, for example, in June 23, when I called the top of the 5-year yield curve. You didn't need to be stress testing people at 8 and 9% on mortgage rates, but they were back then. So that was one of the other things that held the market back then, right? Now, no need to fix that buffer. Well, as market conditions change, though, change the damn buffer, right? This is a bit of a classic anchor. Well, it's always been done that way since we can remember, or since 2014 anyway. Okay, then, dummies, change it, right? Several banks and building societies acted. The Skipton, who've been proactive in the space and often quoted, for example, in introducing 100% mortgages, although it was too little too late in my view, because it was after rates had already normalised, said they would lower the stress rate and the income hurdles and raise the LTI limits, that flow limit, loan to income, that stands for, if you don't know, for certain high LTV loans. The CEO argued that with responsible higher LTI lending, so borrowers with over 4.5 times income loans, they have got those loans already out there and they have comparable credit performance thanks to robust underwriting. Others who played ball, Santander put their stress test down by 0.75% above their SVR, which in the real world would allow borrowers to borrow £10,000 to £35,000 more, depending on their circumstances. They were straight off the blocks in March 25 when this guidance was reissued by the FCA. Nationwide did a bit more and reduced by between 0.75% and 1.25% on their stress tests, particularly for those on longer fixes, 5+ year fixes, which allowed 28,000 on average more to be borrowed. HBOS Group did similar, so including Lloyd's, of course, right, dropping roughly 7% on their stress tests from about 8.25 at the time. So they dropped about 1.25%, which gave borrowers around 13% more purchasing power or about 25 grand more firepower on average. So as a summary of the banks there, you can see the buyers could potentially borrow about an extra 25 grand per house. That's incredibly important for house prices. But how long does it take for all that to kick in? Well, months. Of course, you've got that 5-month lag we talked about earlier, but it could provide a shot in the arm by the end of this year, for sure. But certainly looks like providing one into 2026. So the smaller lenders are happy with the limit moving from 100 to 150 million, that base limit that they have on the LTI constrained loans. But of course, the larger lenders want to do more, and they do more, and they affect the market more, right? So my proposed creep upwards from 15%, nice and slow, would do if it wasn't for a political time horizon you were trying to match. Of course, you'd be much more likely to whack it up to 20% now and then deal with that after the election or as you come into the next election. You can move this stuff very quietly, and less than 1% of the population are going to understand what's going on anyway, quite frankly, and very little in the media will actually point out the real life impacts of this sort of stuff. So just this month as well, building societies have been lobbying to increase this 15% limit, because what their argument is they're saying this constrains otherwise creditworthy first-time buyers. So we might see a move here whilst this still is in discussion. Let's see, and if we do, of course, I'll be reporting on it. So you'll know if you've listened before, I like to get into the so what of all of this stuff. What sort of impact, what size might these changes have on the market? Well, we're in the middle of the change here. And so I'll focus on the years 2026 to 28 to see the impact this might have on the market. Let's do the easy bit first. Will it mean that prices go up more than they otherwise would have done? Absolutely, categorically, yes, it does. Well, how much more? That's tougher because we're mid-implementation. There's still consultations and discussions going on. We don't know how much. It's not easy. Is it even worthwhile to say it adds 1% or 5% over the next 3 years? But there will be a material impact. How do you go about forecasting it? Well, let's try this. If you take it as read that the average large lender has increased affordability by about 25 grand per borrower by tweaking stress tests after their FCA reminder, that's one way to look at it. People can borrow about 10 to 11% more than they would have done. So this is based on the average mortgage size for a first-time buyer, and stats from UK Finance that I discussed last week and the week before. 10 to 11% more available to borrow than you otherwise would have done. There will still be that flow limit kicking in, of course. It's not just the stress test, so that will still hurt at 4.5 times income. Although that 100 million to 150 million move for each lender, it's chicken feed to the big guys. You know, mortgage lending was nearly 47 billion just in the first quarter of this year. So you can see that that limit only affects a small percentage. That, you know, it's 20 lenders, it's $1 billion. So if there's 40 mortgage lenders, it's a couple of billion. It's something, it's a few percent, but it's not as much as the 10 to 11% of extra affordability you're given by the stress test moving. So Savills have predicted an extra 14% to 24% more first-time buyer transactions over the next 5 years. It manifests itself as 47,000 to 80,000 more first-time buyer purchases. Savills model this into an extra 5 to 7.5% of growth, all on top of the normal baseline growth, right, which could be seen as inflation, because it's been a pretty good proxy over the years. In years where you throw a dart at something, inflation has been a pretty good effort, although it's more delayed and lagging in the cycle. Unfortunately, it's not as simple as looking at the inflation rate today, just to be clear. But that's sort of, 1% extra per year, 1.5% extra per year. No real clumping, they think. Now, I don't agree with that. I think slightly differently. You'd have a whole number of first-time buyers in the pipeline, who were backed up, who would clear out slightly, and that would clump things more towards the beginning of the period, more impact sooner. It's just how it normally happens in the real world when a system normalizes. Things are great at the moment. Conditions are right to buy. Let's get on with it. So you go from, we're all held up and we're held back by stress tests, and if they change the flow limit, to quick, let's get on with it. And that probably takes about 3-ish years to really manifest itself. So I see it much more as front loaded, and you could easily see 2.5–3% a year being added on to what you otherwise would have expected as house price growth. And that will see you in the 6% plus sort of category, potentially in some of those years, 26 to 28, I'm talking about here, just to be clear. It's very possible a lot of these potential borrowers haven't heard about these changes yet. And of course, there hasn't been a mad amount about them because they're not all completely confirmed. Many are still in discussion, right? Now, it's not right to consider the constraints already on affordability just by having normal interest rates rather than cheap ones, of course. But the pool of people who've been sitting waiting for rates to go back down has been dwindling, although it won't be down to zero just yet. If interest rates do ease a little, I don't see it coming much on mortgages, as I've said. My best boundary is sort of 5.5% cost of buy-to-let debt, including arrangement fees being amortised and all that sort of thing. But hopefully I've been too bearish here. So rates down plus easier lending conditions could really be kindling for the fire. Can we build more houses though? Well, not quickly, but if prices do start to look very healthy, which we've obviously got a reasonable recipe for here, the house builders will ramp up their activity, and that will help Labour at least get to come somewhere near 1 year where we see 300,000 homes being built. Now, if they fudge the books and all the rest of it, they might just say, well, 300,000 times 5 is 1.5 million. And we have to get rid of all the conservative problems first of all. But maybe, just maybe in 2028, 29, they can achieve that. I don't know. The limit is certainly around 275 to 300,000 in any 1 year, as far as most of the intelligent commentary, because it bears in mind Labour constraints, small l, Labour, obviously. It bears in mind materials constraints. It bears in mind the system just hasn't got enough people in it and enough things in it and enough companies in it anymore, apart from anything else, to suddenly be able to build all of that stuff all overnight. What it might mean, of course, and you have to consider this the other way around, is it might mean more transactions. Now, stamp duty's worked in the opposite direction there. But if you can borrow more, you can put more deposit towards the stamp instead, can't you? Savills believe house price growth will outpace income growth in 2026. So their forecast must be moving to 4% plus for 2026, which I think sounds really very sensible at this stage. I think it probably needs to go higher than that. What about regionally before I sign off? Well, 30% of high loan LTI mortgages were in London alone, which won't surprise you. And there's a huge concentration of them in the southeast. So it might be the tonic for the sluggish southern market to allow it to regain some ground on the Midlands of the North, which have trounced it for capital growth since the pandemic. Enough to right the balance completely? Most likely not, but it's bound to help. And we will still follow the ONS figures on this, apart from anything else, on a monthly basis. Affordability still remains a major issue, particularly in London. Deposits required could fall 10% or even up to 22%, according to Savills. So if the deposit blocker really is the blocker, rather than the stress test or the LTI limit, that's going to help. Now, of course, in the real world, all of those things are blockers, right? And they affect different people at different times in different circumstances in different ways. But as nominally wages have moved up and up and up, you'll notice that, of course, that definitely is going to help with multiples of income, apart from anything else, right? So the flip side of this is that a shot in the arm might not make a huge difference in the provinces, which are already doing okay, of course. So the nationwide figures we might expect will converge back together a bit more, with the rules driving the southeast particularly back towards the rest of the UK in terms of percentage increases. If we only consider the north and the Midlands, then house prices will have been up 4 or 5%, of course, in recent years. So that's a very reasonable stab at near-term future price growth. Or, as I say, I think perhaps we can go even better. I'm feeling more like something in the region of 6% might be a good stab for 2026 at this stage. I'll, of course, shape that and finalise that as we go through the year. And we'll see which of these actually turn into reality and which of them are kept on the bench. But we do need to remember that worse terms for stamp duty drags transactions quite a bit before we get overexcited. The fair conclusion is the price impact of these changes being mostly felt in the supply-constrained expensive regions, with the regions simply seeing more transactions than they otherwise would have done. But the timing does look quite clever for the next election, and I must applaud this on completely selfish levels as well, of course. Let's look at it. It's a bit of cash back from Rachel after she's already imposed on us, I suggest. Now, if you haven't booked for Thursday, 3rd of July, for the next property business workshop on joint ventures and mergers and acquisitions, then let's face it, if you're listening to this right now, you probably aren't coming. But I know some people do have to book late because they have commitments and they need to get stuck in late onto bookings. We have still taken a few bookings in the last week, and as I say, there's a couple of spots left. So it's a guaranteed fabulous day of learning and discussion. Get booking if you are coming. The link's in the show notes. bit.ly/PBWSEVEN. And most importantly of all, please remember to keep calm, always listen to the supplement or read the supplement, and carry on. There's bound to be opportunities this year and towards 2030. The risks around at this time, while they feel significant, the geopolitical ones, are far less meaningful to the UK housing market than they have been for several years. Of that, I have no doubt. Prices are on the up. Maybe not in the next 3 months, but certainly over the next 18 months. So good luck, keep calm and carry on. Thank you. So there's one further comment here that I just wanted to comment on that I had on my YouTube while the live was running. Thank you for adding it. It says it seems this RE real estate blow off top is global in nature. I live in Canada and prices are pulling back here as well as in the US and even Australia. Money has no borders. Interesting comment. We're not seeing a blow off top in the UK, primarily because we didn't see a huge bull run. We had this funny ordering of it where we had a significant increase in prices, 21 and 22, but then inflation very much caught up, took over, and we had a market that went downwards a little in 2023 because we had this shock upwards in interest rates, basically sponsored by the foolish budget of Liz Truss in 2022. So we had a little tiny prick to the balloon that let enough air out of it, right? And so we didn't have this same situation. If you look at places like the US, house price growth has drastically outstripped everything in comparison to the UK. So it's really not the same. And I believe Canada was similar. I also have spoken over recent weeks about how the difference between the longs and the steepness of the yield curves at the moment will continue to impact places like the US, where their 5-year mortgage rate is like 6.9 and stuff like that. I mean, that's problematic. Our 5-year mortgage rate, which is really part of the driver, is 3.75 at the moment, compared to 6.9. It's nearly double the amount of interest. It really is as simple as that. So hugely off-putting in the States. We've had our off-putting and normalisation, our smack round the face, and now we've come back. So we haven't needed that blow off top, or arguably we had the blow off top thanks to Liz Truss, is one way of looking at it. Money has no borders, I agree, and I'd expect it probably to be flowing more out of the US than anywhere at the moment. But does that necessarily mean it goes to Canada, it goes to the UK, whatever? Not necessarily. It really depends on how bullish or not you are on the economic system there. And the current narrative is the UK taxes too much, even though it doesn't tax as much as quite a lot of other countries, but it's the change internally that's caused the problem. The non-dom rules are a huge mistake, putting people off from resettling in the UK. People who pay a lot of tax one way or another, just because they won't give 40% of their wealth to the UK exchequer if they die here, It's ridiculous to expect that anyway. Utterly ridiculous. But there we go. Thank you for the comment. Very thought-provoking. And thanks everyone who carried on to listen to the bonus segment. I'll be back next week with more Propenomix. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. All the best. Have a great week.